This week's online lecture is entitled Safe and Ethical Use of Digital Technologies, or as I prefer to call it, When Good Technology Goes Bad. It's part of Connected Classroom's coursework. There are two main ideas I want to, or learning intentions I want you to take away from this online lecture. The first of those is to be aware of the broad range of potential risks of using digital technologies in the classroom. We often focus on those of a predatory or sexual nature, of a bullying nature, but there are other potential downsides that I want you to be aware of. And I also want you to think about some strategies and make you aware of resources for dealing with these risks as a teacher. Before we get into the risks, I just want to do a little bit of a recapping to set the scene. There are a number of pressures put on teachers to integrate digital technologies into their teaching practices. And unlike Zayn Malik, I'm not sure that it's a wise decision for your career options to ignore these pressures. But let's briefly recap what some of them are. The first set of pressures come from parents. The allure of digital technologies is highly prized by most parents. Many parents want their children's school to be able to boast the latest gadgets and devices, seeing these as a symbol of a high-quality educational experience. Parents expect schools to be using digital technologies. This is partly because many parents are using these technologies themselves and want their children to do likewise at school. This fascination with technology is particularly interesting to middle-class families and parents with the cultural, economic and technological capital that draw upon and feed into the use of digital technologies for social advantage. And Neil Selwyn, in his book To Schools and Schooling in the Digital Age, is a really worthwhile read. It's one of the books on your suggested reading list and I think available online. Governments want to be seen to be meeting the expectation of parents. They also want bang for their buck in terms of their investment in technology. So refer to last week's lecture around learning improvements connected to introducing and integrating digital technologies. Governments proselytise the benefits of digital technologies in helping to create effective digital citizens. The use of digital technologies is embedded in two important policy documents that translate the government's objectives around digital citizenship into policies. These affect you quite directly. The AITSL stands for teachers, which we've been addressing in detail this semester, and in the curriculum, both in AusVELS, which is current this year, and in the newly released Victorian curriculum F10, where digital technologies is now its own new curriculum area. Industry or employers increasingly expect the education system to equip students with digital literacies, amongst other 21st century skills that we've discussed in previous lectures. There are also those digital teachers, pressures from within the education system from people, a bit like me, who see potential to harness digital technologies to enhance learning when coupled with appropriate pedagogical practices. Another source of pressure on teachers comes from the students themselves. As we learnt in Introduction to Educational Settings in Society, students are an integral part of the online world. They live, breathe, sleep, eat it. It's probably an exaggeration, but you get the idea. And increasingly, students are expecting that digital technologies are an integral part of what they do in the classroom. The online world increasingly offers students access to friends, entertainment and information at the touch of the button, or more recently, the swipe of a finger. It also offers that information in multiple modalities that can make the information come to life in ways that are not possible in a plain old classroom. And as we've discussed in previous lectures and in class, digital technologies can offer a platform for students to become publishers on a global scale, to be creators of content, to be able to access experts in a range of fields, visit to virtual worlds, or other parts of the world that they can't visit physically. Technology can become a cognitive partner, to use David Jonason's words from last week's lecture. However, Not everything in the world of the internet and digital technologies, for the two are now inextricably linked, is rosy. There are some dark and dangerous things lurking, ready to capture the uninitiated. But before we talk about those dark and dangerous things, I want to talk to you a little bit about moral panics. The term moral panic was first used in the early 1970s to describe sporadic episodes where society reacts melodramatically to a perceived threat to the values, principles, and well-being of the civilized world. In times of moral panic, the media acts as a magnifying lens that sensationalizes and distorts stories in a way that perpetuates the panic. Think about some of these panics represented in these images. In my parents' era, the rock and roll of the 1950s and early 1960s was seen to something akin to the devil. In the 1980s, we had a moral panic around the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and it was going to be the end of the civilized world. More recently, if we look at this final picture here, technology is a common target for moral panics, particularly the internet. As Jennifer Masters puts it, the internet is seen as a trap that turns normally law-abiding citizens into social deviants. For example, some people may interpret this little image of the boy on the line. It's easier to get together with my friends in an online game than in real life. The moral panic that ensues from that is that our children will be turning into isolate rejects, unable to communicate with each other in the real world, only in the online world. A more recent moral panic we've seen is in the press surrounding the OECD report I shared with you in last week's lecture, where the huge claims around the report is that there's no improvements in learning from integrating technology and it's all a waste of government and taxpayers' money. That's an example of the sensationalism that the media attaches to things that they touch on. And of course, the moral panics surrounding social media and its associated evils are endless, particularly the evil of grooming children for pedophilic exploitation and the implications for mental health of our young people arising from things like cyberbullying, trolling and sexting. Most moral panics have a basis in reality, including those that I've just highlighted that surround the use of technology in schools. Bad things do happen that are facilitated by the internet. Some people, including Jennifer Masters, who is one of the suggested readings for this week, argues that we could transfer most of the stories about the evils of technology to an era before digital technologies without changing the general intention. She argues there's always been scandals and bad things happening to people. The internet doesn't make a difference. There's always been bullying, there's always been sexual predators. However, other people, including me, would argue that the ease of access to people and information that the internet brings does magnify the associated risks. It is easier to groom young people online. It is easier to bully young people online. It is easier to defame young people on the internet. So in conclusion, I guess I'm sitting on the fence a little bit here. I believe we need to think carefully and critically about engaging in a moral panic around the technology. We also need to acknowledge that there are dark and dangerous spaces on the internet that pose a risk to young people, and that as teachers, we have a responsibility to minimise those risks. So that leads us to a couple of important questions. What are the risks, the dark and dangerous spaces on the internet that come into our classrooms? How can these risks be mitigated so children and young people can be supported in becoming confident and competent digital and cyber citizens? I'm going to start with some of the most commonly identified risks. The first of those is exposure to age-inappropriate material. and that can happen at any stage of schooling, particularly with young people below the age of 16. In this category, we include sexually explicit content, images of child sexual abuse, content that is providing instruction, promotes or advocates crime, violence or acts of terrorism. They are in fact illegal. And footage of real or simulated violence or criminal activity. This last point is an interesting one when you consider the number of children, even primary school age children, playing games like Grand Theft Auto, where the simulated violence is incredibly realistic and graphic. So there are considerations around what is now increasingly acceptable behaviour for young children to engage in. But those are the four main areas of inappropriate material. Most young people, and I say most, don't deliberately seek out inappropriate content when they are at school. They may choose to do so at home, particularly adolescents. But whilst undertaking online searches, children and young people may inadvertently stumble across content that is inappropriate. They may also be referred to that content by their peers. So what can you do as a teacher? One of the most common reactions that schools and education systems adopt is to apply filters to school internet access. I've given a link here. I've also provided a link on the course Blackboard to the Victorian Education section that describes the filters that are in place in Victorian government schools. I'm expecting that Catholic schools would be very similar and that independent schools would have their own approaches. So filtering that blocks access to inappropriate sites is one of the common reactions. However, nothing beats appropriate supervision of what the children and the young people in your classrooms are looking at. Make sure you can view the screens of your students, wander the classroom, don't be stuck at the front, not seeing what they are seeing. Talk to students about the inappropriate content that they come across. Talk to them about how they're feeling about it, why you believe it's inappropriate. Question the sorts of things that they're seeing and viewing. Establish agreed actions for the children and the young people in your classroom to take when they do inadvertently come across inappropriate content. And there's always responsibility on teachers to report sites that are stretching the boundaries of legality, particularly those that involve child sexual abuse, promoting or advocating crime, violence or terrorism. Those sites are illegal. I think that unwanted contact is one of the most despicable acts that people can take to young people online. Not everyone online behaves appropriately or honestly. Online grooming is a really dangerous and risky undertaking for young people, and it refers to the act of adults making online contact with a child, that is, someone under the age of 16 years, with the intention of facilitating a sexual relationship. It doesn't take long when you Google it to find pretty horrific examples of adults taking on the persona of a younger person and luring young people into very unsafe physical places after establishing a seemingly innocent online relationship. So some things that you can do is to educate students about the threats posed by people online and online relationships and the dangers of establishing relationships with people that you don't know and you can't vouch for. Identifying, keeping an eye out for those students who may be vulnerable. And these are students who might be behaving in a more inappropriate way offline, as a way of playing out what they're doing in an online space. Refer students who are being groomed to appropriate student support services, and report the activities to the Australian Federal Police, who have jurisdiction in this area. Cyberbullying is one of the more common forms of inappropriate online behaviour that young people engage in. And cyberbullying has incredibly serious ramifications for most young people. Can badly affect their self-esteem, their confidence, their relationships in the real world, their performance at school, their relationships with family and friends, and their relationships with you. So what does cyberbullying look like? What might it look like? It can be abusive texts and emails, hurtful messages, images and videos that are circulated. It could involve imitating others online, excluding others online, nasty online gossip and chat. And it's incredibly hurtful. And I think that cyberbullying demonstrates the way in which the online spaces magnify what happens with bullying. It's insidious because it is so public. We've all seen ads of messages that go viral, or Facebook messages that go viral. So all the world can see what's being done to a person. And it can be relatively anonymous, unlike bullying in the playground or the schoolyard, for example, where you know who your perpetrator is. Very often with cyberbullying, you don't know, you just have suspicions. And I guess one of the increasing concerns around cyberbullying is the consequence of increased youth suicide as a result of inappropriate online behaviour. An important thing to recognise is that cyberbullying, like any form of bullying, is not simply a one-off event, but is usually a sustained activity over time. Look out for signs of students who are being bullied online. Look out for changes in their personality, particularly those students who become more withdrawn or anxious, or angry or crying, or who appear quite distressed. If there are very unexpected changes in their friendship groups, if their schoolwork starts to suffer, lack of focus in the classroom, an increase in their negative self-perception. All of these sorts of signs indicate that the child or the young person may be the target of cyberbullying and struggling. In any case, these are the sorts of observations that you should report to your school administration and parents and carers for action. Schools these days are quite well equipped to deal with cyberbullying. There are extensive professional development programs offered to schools each year to bring them up to date with the latest tricks and trends in cyberbullying, and to put in place policies and strategies to help deal with instances of cyberbullying. Once again, educating young people in our schools about how unacceptable cyberbullying is probably the best starting point, and to maintain vigilance, I guess, is the thing that you can do. And to link practices like cyberbullying back to the values that the school holds dear, and to make students live those values through their actions. Trolling is another form of inappropriate online behaviour, which is sometimes confused with cyberbullying. But as I just said in the previous slide, cyberbullying, as with any bullying, is usually a sustained or repeated attack on a particular target. Trolls, on the other hand, simply set out to annoy whoever they can. It's not necessarily a personal attack, but it's a way of seeking attention, making themselves feel bigger than they really are, and poking fun at whoever they can. They don't care who is upset by what they say. Just to give you a quick definition, it's an anonymous abuse or intimidation of other people online simply for the fun of it. I'm not quite sure how people get fun out of that, but obviously there are some trolls around. It's to watch the reaction, so they're seeking a reaction. Therefore, the best way of dealing with online trolls is to ignore the inflammatory statements. Another strategy is to block that person from your social media, keep blocking them, and report trolls to your website or social media administrators. Keep reporting them. Once again, as teachers, it's up to us to educate the young people in our classrooms about that this is just not cool behaviour. There's no way that it can be considered cool or fun, and that the act of humiliating other people and abusing other people is just not acceptable. So education about how society considers these behaviours is a really important part of what we now are required to do at school. So to summarise, those actions that you can take: simply block, ignore, and report. Sexting is a disturbingly common occurrence amongst young people, facilitated by the ubiquitous distribution of mobile devices, particularly phones. The definition is written here: creating and or distributing sexual images with minors. And this may, in some states in Australia, be illegal, as it constitutes the production and or distribution of sexual abuse materials. One of the best known cases of sexting related to a young girl from the US called Amanda Todd, whose life was turned inside out and upside down after she was convinced by a rather unsavoury character from Europe to post inappropriate images of her breasts online, and the ultimate consequence was her suicide after she had posted a YouTube video explaining her story that went viral. A quick search of YouTube of Amanda Todd will show you what is quite a disturbing and moving video of a victim of this particularly unsavoury practice. One of the unfortunate things is that young people often think it's cool. Young people, particularly those whose hormones are raging and who are experiencing and exploring their sexuality for the first time, think it's a very grown-up kind of a thing to do. Not helped when they see examples of this in the media. Think of Ricky Nixon and that young teenager in the St Kilda Football Club from a few years ago. It's not cool. Again, not a cool thing to do, but something that happens probably too frequently. Again, what can you do as a teacher? What is being done in schools? Again, empowering students by educating them, so implementing a cyberspace curriculum in which sexting is part of the focus of what you're teaching young people about these types of practices. Teach them how to manage their messages, and again, report suspected or reported cases to local police because it may well be illegal. This might be an appropriate time for you guys to take a bit of a break. So far, we've dealt with some of the really dark side of the internet for young people: inappropriate contact, unwanted contact, inappropriate content, unwanted contact, cyberbullying, trolling, and sexting. Oh, what a dark, dark space it can be. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the negativity of this, take a bit of a break and come back to the next part of the lecture at your leisure. Okay, part 2 coming up. Those topics that we covered in the first part of the lecture are particularly yucky. But wait, there's more. Not quite in a sexual and predatory nature, but some more unethical behaviours that we need to consider as teachers. For some generations, decades and decades, education has kept itself quarantined from the commercial sector for fear that children and young people in their care would be unduly influenced by commercial partnerships. As we move deeper into the 21st century, we see some of those barriers between the commercial world and educational providers being eroded. Some people think that this brings benefits to the school community in terms of increased resources, whilst others, particularly teachers, take a slightly dimmer view and see it as the thin edge of the wedge. Let me draw a bit of a parallel to some ethical issues. These sorts of things I'm going to talk about now are not legal, but in my view, not quite right either. So there are commercial influences that occur in the online spaces. There are many sites that purport to entertain children and young people, but these sites carry with them subtle and sometimes not so subtle commercial elements designed to hook the children and young people into spending money and engaging in commercial transactions. Here are some examples. The Myverse. This is an online community that you can access directly from your Nintendo device. So it's really a gaming community for people using Nintendo platforms. Throughout the community, there are many ads and special deals for new Nintendo games and devices. I see this as a really underhanded marketing campaign designed to increase brand penetration and sales. And I think it's not quite ethical. In another example, back in the 1960s, I used to play with these sorts of paper dolls where you had your little paper doll in her cute little innocent underwear. You cut her out, pasted her onto some cardboard, and then you got sheets and sheets of outfits that you could cut out. And you cut these quirky little tabs out, these little things here, and you hook the tabs over the shoulders and around the hips of the little doll, and you could dress your little doll up. So now, in the 21st century, we don't need to actually cut out the paper dolls. We can go on to Stardoll, which is essentially the same sort of thing. You get your doll, and then you get access to lots of outfits, and you can dress your doll up. The interesting thing is that you can end up dressing your doll in designer outfits for which you pay a fee. I think this is rather insidious and rather dishonest. And for the little kids, Moshi Monsters. Moshi Monsters are the online version of Tamagotchis, or there was another more recent iteration of those little electronic devices. I clearly remember taking my own children's Tamagotchis to a really important meeting with the Premier on one occasion because they would need feeding and educating whilst I was at work. So Moshi Monsters. Moshi Monsters is free, at least initially, and it's a safe online game where you adopt your own pet monster and go on amazing adventures together, or so says the hype from Moshi Monsters. You can play games and puzzles to earn rocks and level up your monster and so on. But you can also upgrade your membership for a fee to gain access to other puzzles and adventures and more rocks and create more wonderful online environments for your little monster pet to live in. Again, something that starts out innocently and free, but sucks the child in, and before you know it, there's some debt being racked up. It's really important when we as teachers are evaluating the sorts of resources that we use in the classroom to look at the commercial implications. what advertising might be accompanying the apps that we choose that are initially free. Do we get hooked into those apps and then find that we need to keep paying to gain access to another set of avatars or another set of activities? Some of the apps that we've been exploring in class actually come with this. Telegami, for example, is initially fairly inexpensive, but to improve the functionality and the flexibility of what you can do in the program, you end up having to pay a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So we need to be careful about the underlying business models of the sorts of apps and activities that we provide in our classrooms for our students, and be aware of what the implications are, and make sure that we're dealing with those organisations and applications where there is a high level of transparency around the commercial implications of using their particular product. Here's a question for you. In the last 6 months, how many of you have illegally downloaded a TV program, a movie, or some music? I am pretty sure that very few of you would not count yourself in that group. This is a cultural practice that is very mainstream, particularly amongst your generation and the younger generation. This general acceptance that illegally downloading copyrighted materials such as music and films without paying the owners of that material for those rights is an acceptable practice in our culture. Ask any local film producer or music artist about how difficult it is to make a living off their creativity when no one is paying for their work. When this cultural practice extends to schools illegally downloading apps and software, then we have real problems. Some years ago now, when Inspiration, which is a mind or concept mapping visual thinking tool, was first put on the market, it was priced at the top end of the market, and some schools, a number of schools, felt that it was unaffordable. It still prices itself fairly highly, and about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, I'm getting a bit old, there was a school in Melbourne, in outer Melbourne, that decided that they would have an illegally acquired version of the application on their school server. With spiders and bots and cookies, it soon became apparent to the purveyors of that application that this school had contravened their terms of trade, and instead of paying $2,000 for the site license for that application, the school ended up paying $70,000 in fines and legal fees to the owners of copyright. So it is really important that when you are in a school as a teacher, you are not using or promoting the use of illegally downloaded materials. It's up to you as a teacher to explore the Copyright Act and be familiar with the fair use provisions for education of different media, copyrighted media, and make sure that you're not contravening. And here's a heads up: avoid any content produced by the Olympic Federation, anything to do with the Olympics, just don't use it, or Disney, or Facebook. They will hunt you down and send letters of demand as soon as look at you. So that's to be avoided at all costs. Here's another ethical issue for you. How you appear or are represented in the online world, that is your digital reputation, can have really important consequences. For young people's post-school life, it can paint a particular picture of you. But let's not forget just about the students. Let's think about you as teachers and your online digital reputation. How are you perceived by others online and offline, both now and into the future? A poor digital reputation can affect your relationships and your job prospects. So it's really important that you right now, as prospective teachers, are aware of the picture that you're painting of yourself online and start to protect that digital reputation today. Make sure that your social media privacy settings are as high as they possibly can be. One of the things that I notice, I often have friend requests or befriend some of my ex-students on the day that they graduate in December every year. It's my way of keeping a network of my ex-students, and it proves very useful for my own career and for my students, my current students, to be in touch with ex-students. But what is really interesting is the frequency with which many of them have changed their names to something that is not their name, because the students in their classrooms, and in this case I'm talking primarily about primary school teachers, graduates, the children in their classrooms as young as grade 3 are sending them Facebook friend requests. So make sure that your digital reputation is safe and that your private social media is kept quite separately from a professional presence. Let's return now to the second of the key questions I posed earlier in this longish lecture. How do we mitigate the risks? Schools' initial responses have been the following. Ban any mobile devices, and I know that many of you who have been discussing your ICT experiences whilst on your recent placement have mentioned this practice that students are not allowed to have their devices in the classroom or certain other areas of the school. Social media such as Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, etc. are automatically blocked by schools and not allowed to be used. The other, as I've already mentioned, the other common practice in schools is to filter websites, so only those websites that are approved by the Education Department are accessible to the students. And these are fairly common responses, and many people would say they are the correct responses. However, both the moral panics that surround technology use and the risks around technology, and the more measured yet serious concerns about those dark places of the internet that we've just explored, those concerns about safe and ethical use of digital technologies, all tend to position children and young people in particular ways, as innocent, as vulnerable, as helpless, as potential victims. And whilst in some cases that may be an accurate position, do we do our children and young people any favours by perpetuating that positioning of them? Some writers and researchers in this area, such as Andrew Hope, whose 2010 article I have recently added to your reading list for this week, they argue that schools have in fact been seduced by an exaggerated or distorted risk discourse surrounding school internet use, and argue that schools overreact to student activity online and the risks of the online world by blocking their legitimate educational engagement. He argues that there is a manifestation of a culture of over-blocking in schools, and this is particularly detrimental in schools where they are trying to foster a more Web 2 based approach to network learning. He argues that in school cyberspace, the purity of the internet, those advantages that we talked about in previous lectures and in class, and the dangers of the internet, so that purity and that danger coexist with material and activities in the cyberspace perceived as threatening to student well-being, and that's competing with real opportunities for beneficial and network learning. So here's my argument. What if we changed that positioning of young people and children in our care and acted in ways that empowered these young people to become other than the victim? What if we acted in ways to provide those same young people with the skills that they need to safely and ethically navigate the online world that is inescapable? So let's reframe that question. How can the risks be mitigated so children can be supported in becoming confident and competent digital and cyber citizens? As Jennifer Masters argues, she's also one of the suggested readings, can we think more about the opportunities where children can develop and practice communication, social, and multiliteracy skills via internet applications? Can we use the internet to facilitate young people's innate curiosity and sense of wonder in age-appropriate settings? Likewise, Andrew Hope talks about motivating teachers and students to engage in low-level risk-taking in schools, seeking to foster excitement, identity, social understanding, and technological skills, but in a way where the risks are minimised. So rather than ban devices, block social media, filter out websites that are potentially really educationally advantageous, can we equip our young people with the skills that they need to navigate this world far more safely, to empower them to resist the temptations, to be able to recognise what the inappropriate activities of the online world are, and how to respond appropriately to those instances. One other thing to consider, and this is a reasonably controversial sort of a statement, and one that Jennifer Masters talks about, that the instances of the dark and dangerous side of the internet are reasonably low by comparison to the number of interactions that young people safely engage in. So the risk, she argues, is relatively low. So why all the fuss? I think there's a bit of a fuss because if some of these things do take place, the consequences are really serious. So we do need to be mindful of those risks. But the question is, how do we as teachers navigate that blurry line between protecting those in our care, which we have a legal and an ethical responsibility to do, but at the same time providing opportunities for our students to develop skills in navigating, locating, and evaluating what they view, and communicating effectively with people who can help their learning. There's the dilemma for all of you.